James Song Dinan Yore and some women show the Jang Beto. Kyuju Long Renshin Mabala, Dunje Tendin Job, Kamajang, Tender Ume Luni Yunushi, Tegama Sur Tenan Z such. The Dembare Tanya to your Ranzen, Guy in the Zane, the Ranzen kept a shula, the using Hagal Hamidaba. Taco Penrent against shower. Chisane Kyuju Long Renshin Mabala, Dunje Tendin Job, Kamajans.
In this Tsongkhapa's text, Lam Rim Chenmo, at some point in his section on special insight, he has an interval verses that he writes. In one of them, he writes the following. He says that, "O learned ones who are learned in the middle way treatises." So this is on page 325, where he writes that, "My friends who are learned in the profound middle way treatises, although it is hard for you to posit dependent origination of cause and effect within the world devoid of inherent intrinsic existence, it is better to take the approach by saying such is the middle way, system of the middle way." So, and this is very true because what Tsongkhapa is pointing out is that in the course of inquiry into the ultimate nature of reality, and when you have negated inherent existence, existence by means of intrinsic nature and objective existence, then one cannot maintain any notion of reality that is objectively grounded. So there's literally nothing left that one can, hold on to that is objectively grounded. Yet at the same time, one still needs to accord. One still needs to maintain functions of harm and benefit, cause and effect, and so on. So, and that is where the challenge really is. How, in the aftermath of negating any notion of intrinsic existence and objective reality, how one still maintains a notion of, coherent notion of a reality. That really becomes the challenge.
다 유준이 수잔에 정신이 예바당 민광 예바지 다 정신이 예바다 민광 예바 니레 마도베 유준메 유준나만 리베 네베스 치말레 왜메도 다 사실 뜻이나 다나요다 유준이레스 유준나만 리베 네베인데 다 치말레 왜메도 냠데 로테이 쳐서 창화를 차오스. 자, 또 고발을 나리야. 다 타녀다. 다도 타녀 좀 시고로다. 각자 캣베 슈기다 타녀 시고로. 타녀 연상 시고로 있는잖아요. 고발을 나리야. 딕 카우사레스. 남제서로 봐. 동조 두야디 또 레르그레스. 다전에 동부 땡지도 셔야지. 다 시작하고 쳐요. 자, 이제 인도산에 거기서 나올이야. 탄년 정점 참문디, 탄년 참문 정점디 다 하고 쳐요. 인도산에 우메다 탈투베 가사야 니니도 써셔야 되듯이. 나디 가래 싸움다 냠용으로도 충분히 있나? 애니 직시해야지. 다 딜이야 팬 토시도 딜. 다 민국왕기 이어지마도 매버시차. 다 민국강 소소를 배스럽나 말이스. 컨트롤했으나 다 타녀도 잡아. 타녀도 잡고 던져도 타녀에 참으시지 맨해봐. 대성도 마세요. 터도 주지 그게 맨해봐. 다 대이 때문에 다 타녀도 해야지.
Similarly, in Tsongkhapa's essence of eloquence, differentiating the definitive and interpretive scriptures, there Tsongkhapa also, in dealing with the understanding of the notion of reality, in the aftermath of negating inherent existence, there also Tsongkhapa makes a similar point where he says that if we try to examine the notion of existence, and there are only two possible ways in which we can understand the notion of existence. One is existence by means of inherent nature or inherent reality, or existence by means of some nominal criteria or nominal existence. And between these two, since existence by virtue of intrinsic nature has proven to be completely untenable, so there is no alternative left other than to accept that the existence is only nominally defined. Similarly, Tsongkhapa makes also similar observations in his Ocean of Reasoning, which is a commentary on Nagarjuna's Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, where he again lists the two possible ways in which one can understand the concept of existence, and having demonstrated that existence by virtue of inherent nature, which is an objectively grounded existence, is untenable, he says that the alternative left is a nominal existence. Therefore, one should direct one's mind towards that angle. Similarly, in Gompa Rapsel, his elucidation, clear elucidation of the Buddha's, clear elucidation of the thought, which is a commentary on Chandrakirti's Entering the Middle Way, Tsongkhapa explains that when we think, when we probe into our understanding of the nature of existence of things, he says that although kind of having an ascertainment of emptiness by means of negation, that is comparatively easier, but in contrast, having an understanding of the reality in terms of dependent origination in the aftermath of the negation, that is a very difficult challenge. And so he says, in fact, says that this being able to accord a reality, a coherent notion of existence or reality to things in the aftermath of having rejected existence, any form of objective inherent existence. Here he says this is the greatest difficulty and challenge in the context of the middle way thinking, middle way philosophy. So here, one thing that is most helpful in enabling us to at least maintain a coherent notion of reality within the Madhyamaka context is to look at the three criteria that Tsongkhapa presented for conventional existence, which we touched upon earlier, that it is known to a worldly convention, that the known convention is not invalidated by any other valid conventional cognition, and furthermore, that
타녀에 참아시지 못 넣었을 때 소수 나를 직 통대로 직티. 또 제지 야 따져시 되어이나. 양은 미현식 때문이나. 딱 하도 생리에 타는 시야도 지고 그러지. 내가 직니 단예에 소수 양자 따지세. 미주 따지세. 미도 무슨 tun나도 주의운데 이해를 타지.
So this second
이걸 남배 즉 섬섬의 근시성소를 돼야지. 타녀 저식 리베 근시 예미셔다 가오르서 와. 단디 근시 타녀 줘야 거라 딱좀 세네. 강사의 천시지 예배 룩스세네. 될 근시 나버 셔봐서 타녀 따바 인도자네. 단담 저식 리베 짜바 근시 되는 뒤에 제 심벌다. 텐주 룩스셔비나. 그봐. 섬섬 코란조도 들 저식 리베 짜바 쓰고 말이데. 텐주에 낭좀 대이 맞으면 강사서야 낭좀 대이 맞으면 강사가 뭐랑 서버지 가림이 째이잖아요. 시바. 이 시바 샤가치면은 애니 세미기 내걸리 마대차. 사미 이신모도 집에 내걸라. 애니 바잡고 싶지 마대차. 근데 이제는 끝이 없어야지. 근데 셔야지. 낭좀 대이 맞으면 딱좀 세니 예배 룩스 체니 샤가 이잖아요. 델라 전우지지를 내용이야.
So the second criterion, which is that the known convention should not be invalidated by any other subsequent or any other valid cognition, and this may include one's own, the individual's own subsequent cognitions. For example, you may perceive something and think that to be the case, but your subsequent perception of the phenomena may in fact invalidate it if it happened to be a false perception. Similarly, it could be invalidated by valid cognitions of some other third person. So in this sense, this is very similar to the form of verification that occurs in the scientific method, where reputability and intersubjective verification, in other words, verification by some other third person, also becomes an important factor. So the second criterion is very similar to the need for intersubjective verification in the scientific method. And the third criterion is added, which is that the known convention should not also be invalidated by ultimate analysis. So the point of including that is to provide a way of adjudicating between claims that are metaphysically grounded. For example, the mind-only schools claim that the mind-only school, particularly those following after the scripture, their postulation of alaya, foundational consciousness, although they may not see themselves as having made this postulation from the point of view of ultimate analysis, however, from the Madhyamaka Prasangika perspective, postulation of the alaya or foundational consciousness will be seen as having been made in the aftermath of an ultimate analysis, because the whole kind of motivation for postulating alaya, foundational consciousness, to be the true essence of the person from the Madhyamaka point of view is motivated by a form of an ultimate analysis, because they were not satisfied with the everyday level convention which operates at the level of perception and everyday appearance, but rather and they were looking for a kind of a true referent of the term person, something that would have an objective basis, and looking for that kind of essential, the real person. So, pursuing such line of analysis, then they postulate the idea of alaya, foundational consciousness, as being the true identity of the person. And here, for example, the proponents of foundational consciousness are uncomfortable with the idea of sixth mental consciousness as being the person, because they run into and they see that it runs into problems. So therefore, they seek a consciousness that has a more stable basis, and then they identify and they postulate this alaya to be the identity of the true identity of the person. So from Madhyamaka point of view, that whole line of kind of thinking and quest involves a form of ultimate analysis, because it operates beyond the boundary of everyday normal convention.
Yeah. Tsongkhapa ngala 남든지를 본다고 야나 지금 특시 교환 과야 그래서 지금 도파 상으로다 대 상들을 전에 단이야 매듯이 차이고도가 단이야 매듯이 차를 전에 다 패는 것을 되게 하래 근데 인도다 매번 멤버십 다 패는 것을 제가 되게 매번 멤버십 시험다 매번 멤버십 다 세버래 다 유로도 컨트롤했으나 다 민국왕이 여봤으니 시기하래 나를 시험하고 있는 신기 다 델라 디삼단에 오도와 다 땡중사 다 땡지 디삼단에 델라 리베게 무슨 세시거래 드리 메이드잖아요 다들 전에 많이 봤으면 계셨나요? 코레 여당 코라 때네 주대버지. 다 그것은 시사는 시래. 다 때네 주버지. 상무지 거의 전에 다 때네 따버리. 때네 샤버리. 샤를 라네. 진짜 인지 다 마드베 정신도 차와지. 랑은의 줍스도 랑기 모 짐베 전시 거라 전쟁에 이해되지. 그 여러이는 아니 샹을 되고는 와. 안도지 못버리다 나나. 아니 뭐니 좀나 디니 샤베 초베 때네 샤베 아니 때네 샤베 요마리스. 뜻때문에 때네 딱 쓰듯 코르랑 못 준비 지 코르 가서 그래 랑선버지 코르 텐지 땡이야 이 덕시 땡이 예더버지는 때네 샤고합니다 때네 다음은 주면도 자 아람다 민경마로 로미시사 이거 주체지 패진로서요 패지 신문 나오다 나주고 패줄 거예요 저상 다도 이메인도잖아요. 다도 상상하는데 그 때에 따거래. 다 때에 따 시잖아요. 다 노겐데 민들이. 자리네 민대 왕게 이어서 세지. 다 딘디직로 커서나 아니 신은 안 돌이야. 능수 거리시는 것도 봐. 독상도 독스다 때베이나. 속도 치르자. 가리네 독스다. 능수 때인데 전쟁만에 요하는 것도 와. 당 저기 싸움들잖아요. 다 떼샤지마다 내대지. 따유 민장서시마다 내대지. 거에도 쉬어야지도디 능수디 전쟁만에 요하지. 다 나요인데 다디 통마를 받는 머리배 왕기. 다 샤베. 다 그게 가서 그래. 디경기. 저 주변 경기. 아니 준한테 샤베 삼아지 전쟁만에 매신도 전쟁만에 요하지. 나요도 와. 다 각성문지 가서 우리에게 챵바를 시다 뒤타는 패시 연구도 소리도 와. 다도 소 알로지. 냐는 넘주지 비치제. 에네 다 지 가서 그래. 내가 차로. 니기 매도 차로. 다 never mind. 요아레스. 다 유루고 민고왕이었지. 다 내가 하면 땡중을 그 싸움다면이나 되네 저 som거야. 나도 저 싸움다니. 저 땡중을 이게 동반을 봐 고아지. 랑투나. 되네디도 고명은 감성선에 동바디 동배텐 땡중전도 샤대야지. 동바에서 샤라라를 태겨. 샤라라에서 뒤질 때가 태겨야 그도 땡기 치와 여봐 니기 다 라면을 먹지 고야지. 나이도 와. 저상 파체니 땡중이 뭐 주는 게 돈이고. 동반이 뭐 수제니 동반이 뭐 주는 땡중신도 잡지. 어다 디시디 아니 남시人家로 직접도 땡지 밀로 통 잡니네. 니시 유인다 근저나 대자죠. 싸와라. 손셔 때 띵서리. 이디 상위 검고에 딱 검색해 좀 살으셔.
So, in terms of actually how to bring these understandings into actual meditative practice, the way in which one can do this is to proceed in the following manner, which may be very helpful. We proceed with employment of or application of a particular form of reasoning, whether it be the sevenfold analysis, of person, or whether it is the diamond slivers analysis, the Chatuskoti, the four-cornered argument, which examines the arising of a phenomena in terms of self, another, both, and neither. And so whatever of the reasoning process that you use, as you apply this form of reasoning, which negates which rejects all the other possibilities, then one will arrive at a point where you will come to recognize that the subject under analysis is unfindable when we search for them by means of such critical analysis. So at that point, you will arrive at a point, a kind of an awareness, a sense of non-existence of the thing under investigation when subject to such critical analysis. And at that point, you must then bring to your mind the recognition, the fact that things do exist is incontrovertible, because things do make an impact. They can cause harm, they can bring benefit. The fact that these phenomena does have an effect in terms of benefit and harm is an incontrovertible proof that they do exist. They possess some manner of existence. Then the question then is, how do we understand that status of existence? In what sense can we say they are existent? And here, one then comes to understand that given that objective inherent existence becomes untenable, the notion of existence that we accord to them must be at some kind of nominal criteria, on the basis of nominal reality. And here, it is helpful to then relate this understanding to the principle of dependent origination. And therefore, principle of dependent origination is often referred to as the king among all reasoning, because the principle of dependent origination, when you use dependent origination as a rationale for arriving at understanding of emptiness, then it points the fact that things are dependent originated indicates their lack of any independent status, and so they are, because of their dependent nature, they are thoroughly contingent, and because they are contingent, their nature is such that they can be real only in relation to some other thing. And once you come to recognize that, then there will be a kind of a realization that the existence that we can accord to reality can only be this relational existence. They can only be understood in terms of dependent designation. And because they are dependently designated, their coming into being and their existence can only be understood in these relational terms. And because they possess this thoroughly relational contingent nature, therefore they are thoroughly dependent upon others. And once you come to recognize that, then you will come to recognize that the status of existence that we can accord to them is only on this nominal level. And for example, Buddha Palita states in his text, he says that if things were to exist by means of their own intrinsic nature, and if things exist in their own right, then we can point our finger to that thing and say that is their essence. So then, if that is the case, then there is no need for things to be dependent upon any other factors. So and this also suggests that if things possess objective reality, some kind of existence by means of their own essence or intrinsic nature, then one should, even before the label is given, the thought that this is so should arise. So this is, in fact, reasoning that Nagarjuna uses in one of his texts, kind of, finely, kind of, crushing. So this is a reasoning that is used by even mind-only school and others as well. But Nagarjuna, in fact, uses that argument in his text, finely kind of, crushing or pulverizing the arguments of the others. So there Nagarjuna also presents this argument. So when you use these kind of analysis, then we will come to recognize that the thought that something is such and such, that kind of identity-based thought can only arise if the thing is dependently designated. If the thing exists only if the thing exists by means of its own intrinsic nature, then the arising of a thought that this is so should not depend upon that thing being labeled before. So in this way, we will come to recognize that only reality that we can accord to things is really a nominal, dependent reality. And when you come to understand this and you cultivate your understanding, further and further, then you relate that then to the way in which normally things tend to appear to you. So now, as a result of, contemplating emptiness, you have come to recognize that things and events do not possess existence by means of intrinsic nature or inherent existence. Yet, when you relate that to your own everyday perception of the world, you also recognize in your everyday perception, you tend to perceive things as possessing such objective existence. And in this way, you will come to recognize there is a disparity between the way things appear to you and the way things really are. And in this way, one can get an experiential flavor to what is called the process of identifying the object of negation. So in a sense, the object of negation will be, the identification will have an experiential kind of dimension, almost as if you're kind of touching something in a naked way. And so in this way, we need to basically kind of combine and use interchangeably various processes. First, applying critical reasoning to demonstrate the untenability of any, kind of unfindability of anything. When you're subject to critical analysis, you then move on to dependent origination and, kind of relate to their own dependent existence. And then from there, you compare that to your own personal everyday perception of the world. And in this way, one will be able to see how understanding of dependent origination leads to emptiness, and how understanding of emptiness leads to dependent origination, so that they mutually complement each other and reinforce the understanding each other. And when this happens, then as Tsongkhapa points out in his three principal elements of the path, where he says that at that point, when without any temporal sequence, simultaneously at the same time, the moment you see the infallible reality of the dependent origination, if the object of your grasping and is totally dismantled, at that point, one has arrived at the culmination of analysis.
타냐도 이게 제주 숨지 소샤 다들만 셜니 지마치 미쇼 셜니 지미쇼 디스토아 티무키 도타베 런신라 두미두로 소베 캬바노 도타네 데자다 시다노 소베 깨원규 디다게 진단 짱 리그 수요 네베이노 스니 쉽지베롱이 타체 니스 디나가 지그샤 단 유모 차당 유모디디 디무텐지 자와치루디 다진나가 시도가 쉽게벨 농전알이야 되살아서 다장 디무 꾸도다고 뭐버는 코나라 두고도 미두고로 소베 개발도도 보고 칠 디무를 타 메데번 주죠 디무를 땜마야 주지 디무 소원이 지쳐로스 있어요 단디 칸이 송도와 디무를 타 메데번 주고 주시 디무를 땜마야 주지 선순대디 해지 차다 참무디기 디무다 충전도 손에 디무티네도 충대도 손에 탐이 되면 주고 주시면서 다양 차상 라바 그는 오모 고발서나 송이가래 응원반의 셰베 민능진이 유무사지 응원반의 셰베 민능진이 유무 라바디 된지도 충대라 에이미리 다디 진짜 유무 라바디디 자와 디무기 두천요 근데 이제 디무를 땜바인 줄 됐어 대단하 유무 차라 탐제 그 난게 싸워를 디무 쳐요고요 근데 이제 디무 쏘니 치렀어 쉽게 변제가 지금 다른 거
So here in page 183, Tsongkhapa, citing from Chandrakirti's commentary on the 400 stanzas, he cites the following. He writes, in fact, before that he writes, ignorance superimposes an intrinsic nature on things. From this, attachment, hostility, and so forth arise. Further superimposing features such as attractiveness or unattractiveness upon that intrinsic nature. Therefore, reason can also be used to eradicate the way that attachment and such apprehended objects. And then he cites from the Chandrakirti's commentary, which reads, attachment and so forth superimpose features such as attractiveness or unattractiveness only upon the intrinsic nature of things that ignorance has superimposed. Therefore, they do not work apart from ignorance, and they depend upon ignorance. This is because ignorance is the main affliction. So here, Chandrakirti identifies two ways in which ignorance is related to the afflictions. In one, he writes, they do not work apart from ignorance, and then in the second, he says they depend upon ignorance. So this may relate to a kind of a more subtle understanding of the levels of some of these afflictions, where in some cases ignorance serving as the basis for the affliction to arise, and in some cases, the grasping at true existence being actually present within the concomitant, within the complex of the grasping, or complex of the affliction itself.
다 차단 전부디 진단 된주고 진단 이게 되듯이 다운데 된지를 배웠으나 디 진단 저 때문에 진단 이게더디 샹도기래지 더 좋더지 저 디무 송제도 송인자 디무 거라 정도지 버렸어 디무 거래 된진지 정도 진짜 버렸어.
So in these cases of subtle affliction, since the ignorance grasping at true existence is concomitant within that complex of the affliction, then the question arises, does that mean that these afflictions themselves are also a form of ignorance? And here the response is given that the grasping at inherent existence that is present, grasping an inherent existence and that is present within that affliction is not by their own accord, but rather through the power of the ignorance. So therefore, and they grasp that inherent existence because of the presence of ignorance with them.
다지네만 쉬고 가셔야지 말고 가서 마친시 다지 샴데 뒤진다 가진 거지 겹쳐온다 내가 사람도 좀 보셔 다 뒤슈데 정루 가정 문제 봐 수 주라지 마치자.
So then, having dealt with the problem of over-negation and under-negation, then the third major outline Tsongkhapa presents is the way in which one's own position identifies the object of negation. So we have already actually dealt with this topic of the question of how to identify the object of negation.
다 리변 수산에 가서 덴진 강설 산 달러 리변 수산에 돈이 더 싫어 다 돈이 더 싫어서 다 돈이 주지 리버티기 덴진들 내용이 있어 코다 지난게와 차용도 다 강서 덴줍디 데미주지 리변 수산에 덴줍 다 가서 그래 이해 미시지 디고는 내용이 덴지 예체 콜은 데미주지 리변 내단디 리변이 네베로 되게 지난게와 건데
So in this context, when we are talking about object of negation of reasoning, we have to understand that when the wisdom of emptiness is cultivated and arises in one, it undermines the grasping. So the manner in which it undermines the grasping at true existence is to really directly oppose the perspective of the grasping, and in this way it undermines that grasping. But as far as the content of that grasping is concerned, the reasoning and the wisdom realizing emptiness, what it does is that it demonstrates that the non-existence of that content, which is the true existence.
다 니버 가자데 샹을 좀 줘야 다 미세 샤스니까 다 배제된다 가자 되고 뭐 태랑 강도 쳐봤어야 돼 제가 teller는 다 규를 기억해야 된다
So the next we will deal with the outline that touches upon the question of what kind of method that one should employ to negate that object of negation, whether one should rely on consequential reasoning or that of syllogism.
다디 신루가고 정루샤바 다 신루가고 지들 먹어제
So
다 정루샤바입니다
So this is presented in two main outlines. One is the refutation of others' position, and the second is presentation of one's own standpoint. So we will read with the second one, which is the presentation of one's own standpoint.
다데 이거 정루샤바니 다人具顺用我的在让了没说不去他不人具顺用我的了西学生么这个超级捐单吧捐的定是也么这个单吧但这个当然的当然的人具的定义是这样的超级的人具是这样的让我们谈是应该的但让我们谈的确实的추숨 다 댄지 거 있는데 추숨 참여 좀 보러다 추숨 참여 내버지 자 다들에게 참여 줄루디 지기 아니 추숨 줍지기 참아대 참아라라야 추숨 대단데 랑문에 쪽에 랑선 나올로 되게 못초에 참아 참아지 인신제라 다 최신 두지가 참아지 인신제라 최신의 랑선을 밀어시 되게 다다 치소 되게 다대 또 진짜디 정규점 랑왕와 탄여도야다 민두베 러시 매번만 루기 샤윤도 진짜 참 미시거다 랑선당할때 뭐주에 참 매버 또 랑선당 참아지 인신제 다 최신제 참아지 인신제라 랑선 나오는 추에 참 추에 시험이 차대기였다. 나 금지도 참아 있는 면세다디 양 되게 러버면 신고라 진단타는 미쳐지. 다 디시가 거다. 자자가 자 근데 인도 참에 두수 투나와다 예매다 디시가 그래.
So here, the main point being discussed is whether or not in one's own understanding of Madhyamaka, one should accept the notion of autonomous syllogistic reasoning. And so it's the term that is being used is swatantra, which means autonomous, and autonomous syllogism or autonomous reasoning. And the supposition here made by the proponents of autonomous syllogism is that any form of inference must occur on the basis of the use of a form of reasoning, a valid reasoning, and that possesses the threefold, three modes of validity. And the idea here is that the subject that is being analyzed must be something that has been verified by a valid cognition that is non-deceptive, undeceptive with relation to its own intrinsic nature. So in other words, the proponents of autonomous syllogism operate from the assumption that when two parties are involved in a debate, and the subject that they choose must be commonly verified on the basis of a certain assumption of the criteria of validation. And the Madhyamaka, from Madhyamaka Prasangika's point of view, that kind of validation becomes untenable, because any notion of a valid cognition that is non-deceptive to the intrinsic nature of phenomena becomes untenable. So therefore, Madhyamaka Prasangika reject the supposition that in order for a kind of a discourse to take place, the subject under discussion must be verified on the part of both parties, where the validation is, the process of validation is accepted by both parties. So that is being rejected here.
Then the end, then this Lama. Then the end, and this Lama does something because and this one, and the children on Goya, 6 years long, about transfer the show, this one. Umar Gubala, morning, Meva, Mawa, Shesser, Merjan. Didn't 6 of June, Chidu, Ranshin, Meva Mawa, Shevani, Tenjuala Coachala, Ranshi, Yaber Mawa, Shevani, Umamawa, the Ranju, Nicola Coachaw, that teacher actually shot. Tenju the Ranju, Mogache, City. And the Diran, make us get Joshua, Ranshi, Yaber Mawa, Ranshi, Meva Mawa, Slovna, just have she to. She and she Tenju, the Ranju was losing, and she and the Shaki was to her. So that Tenju was losing a name, got Jirban the Ranju, Tenju Guru, Tenju, Tenzu Guru. That under the Sanjay Jandama, then Zashu, Drama, Jones, and Tenju so question. That the name that's another Tenju was. That because Tenju some of the Sunji towers on the key in the Tao Gigs. That originally is image Tao gave it Java, gave a the image to some days in drawers and chick. The dig that is really Java water, because I miss it. So can that and what the same wish the words to. That the shed Yashish, Rashi Yamama, Rashi Mabama,
So Tsongkhapa explains here that when we try to understand what is at issue here on the question of whether or not one should accept autonomous syllogism, he says that it is more helpful if you understand the two standpoints as one representing a group that subscribes to some notion of svabhava, intrinsic existence, and the other group that rejects the notion of intrinsic existence even on a conventional level. So Tsongkhapa's suggestion is that it is better to characterize the two camps in this way rather than as Madhyamaka Svatrantika versus Madhyamaka Prasangika. And generally, because otherwise this opens up all sorts of complex questions about how do we define what is a Madhyamaka Svatrantika and what is a Madhyamaka Prasangika and so on. Historically, it is, for example, if you look at the masters like Buddha Palita, in his treatises, the primary form of reasoning that is used is a form of reasoning that draws consequences, by revealing internal contradiction in others' position. Whereas, so the debate sometimes is. And in contrast, if you look at the writings of Buddha, Bhavaviveka and Shantarakshita for that matter, we will also recognize that they tend to use primarily a form of syllogistic reasoning rather than an analysis argument in the form of a consequence. So these masters like Bhavaviveka and Shantarakshita, underlying assumption really is an acceptance of a notion of intrinsic nature, svabhava. So we already discussed that earlier. Whereas the discussion really, and one of the aspects of the discussion is whether it is indispensable to use a syllogistic reasoning in order to generate inferential understanding, or whether one can also, by means of a reasoning that takes the form of consequence, one can also generate inference. So that's one aspect of the debate.
그래서 친절로 잠기 다가 뭐고 녀버 니 냠버 그거 니는 이렇게 도스 로변 랭댕기 땡 최전디 친절로 잠기 녀버서 추의 시베 단 녀버 멤버 그래서 네 머추의 시베 녀버 멤버 추의 시베 녀버 저랑 단지니 캬랑도 야레스 가래서나 균전디 그룹제 껴가고 그룹제셔선데 대치스 단담을 껴와 메테스 담미서 단담을 껴와 메테 시세유르자네 단담을 매바티 그룹제셔를 거인 거야 그룹제셔를 거인 전에 최전대다 단담을 못 주고지 다 쉐어라 단담을 못 주고 쉐이면 전에 단담제로디 못 주고 쉐바리 최전 강시 단담을 못 주고 딘쟁에 그로디 주의 시베니를 찾아야 일단 노스코 이르잖아요. 디 총어디 디체 장점부터 봐. 야는 거 말은 맞지나. 디디기 모추의 시베니도 모추의 시베니고 그래서 시비가리 저랑기 단중원에 주의 시베니도 모추의 시베니가 멤버 저랑 캐나도 왔어. 가래서는 대야도 단담을 껴고 주시셨을 거예요. 알아봤어. 동시에는 제요나 당 가서 뭐마와 말이 우마베 뭐마와 마음속에 있는 전화 매발 맞아.但렉션님 나라 댄치는 친구 로스지 다가 뭐보니 봐 냠벌 그거 니는 캬랑 뭐 니도 쓰다디 다요 대체사데 대치 좀절 막을세 대내글라스 다 껴가고 주시초선 되면 다 껴가고 가서 그게 게임이 주베 급달라스 게임이 주베 급달라 결랑기 믹스 최신 디기디 멋추의 시베 니가 결랑 캐르비어 봐스 결랑가는 멋추고 쓰다디 랑선 나와도 멋추의 시베 결랑 캐르비어레스 랑시 매버마에 우모베 룰라 아니 최신 줍지 참아디 랑선 나와도 추별로 차대어레스 멋추별로 말해 추별로 해서 추별로 얘기해서 자상아 치질로도 치지 말로베 로니기 니든디 망가데스 자 드리면 인도 나는 정시 여버마와다 정시 매버마와 니기 대미 주요에 그도로 정시 여면 저be 그도로 주전 나와 요 말이스
So we will now read from the section where Tsongkhapa cites from Chandrakirti's clear words, Prasanapada, where Chandrakirti really rejects, critiques one of the principal suppositions of the syllogistic reasoning, where the assumption is made that when two parties enter into a dialectical analysis, at that point, the subject upon which the discourse is taking place must be commonly verified. It should not. The subject should be something that is must be accepted at a kind of a common level that does not include imposition of one's own distinct philosophical or metaphysical views about its existence. So when two parties enter into a debate, whatever subject it may be, whose characteristics that you are discussing about, whose properties that you are discussing about, the subject itself should be, accepted at the level where both parties share a notion of its existence. And when you do that, both parties should not bring their own specific metaphysical views about its existence. So now Chandrakirti is critiquing that basic assumption of Bhava Viveka, and he writes, he writes, this is on page 262, and he writes, the same method that was used to show that the position is defective insofar as its basis is not established should be used to show the defect that the reason, because it exists, is also not established.
그죠? 대한의 저번에 점심 리셋 줬어요. 네, 되게 쓰지가 않은 말로 되고. 단 리셋이 시험다서. 리셋로는 타지. 가.
I think that was the translation. So and there are two ways in which this particular passage from critical passage from clear words of Chandrakirti is explained in Tsongkhapa's writing. One here in the Lam Rim Chenmo text, the other one in his Essence of Eloquence text, and the reading is slightly different. And here, the Tsongkhapa reads it in the following. He reads it so that, for example, he says that when in the context of a Madhyamaka critiquing the notion of self-arising that has been postulated by, say, for example, Samkhya philosophers, or any other form of essential arising that Buddhist essentialists have presented. So in that context, and Bhava Viveka himself, he, for example, employs the following form of reasoning, syllogism. He says that sprouts and so on do not possess ultimately real arising because they are so and so. So, and when he uses that kind of reasoning, what Chandrakirti is pointing out is that because you take it for granted that sprouts and so on do not possess ultimately real arising or ultimately real existence, therefore you are already accepting that the sprouts and so on, which are the subject, are things which are posited only by conventional validation. And because they are not objects of ultimate analysis or ultimate analysis, therefore, given that they are conventional, they belong to the conventional reality, therefore the cognition that posits their reality is a form of a distorted cognition. They are not a cognition that perceives the ultimate nature of reality. Given that you assume that, however, so when you use that reasoning against a Samkhya, there will be no commonly shared subject, because so far as the Samkhya, the opponent is concerned, the subject that is being examined is a phenomena that is verified and established by. So, because the opponent against whom the critique of self-arising is being directed is the Samkhya school. And the Samkhya, of course, would maintain that the sprouts and so on, which are being presented, are verified by valid cognition, which is true to their nature. So when Samkhyas and the Madhyamakas enter into a discussion pertaining to the status, ultimate status of sprouts and so on, there will be no commonly shared understanding of the subject. So, so it is in this way Chandrakirti points out a contradiction in Bhava Viveka's position. In Lekshen Nyingpo, however, in Essence of Eloquence, Tsongkhapa reads this passage in a slightly different way, where he says that when a proponent of intrinsic nature and the proponent of a standpoint that rejects intrinsic existence enter into a debate, there cannot be a commonly verified subject, because the proponent of intrinsic existence is going to make the assumption that any valid cognition of the subject. So any validation of the subject will presuppose that that valid cognition is non-deceptive with relation to the intrinsic nature of the thing, whereas the proponent the proponent of the standpoint that rejects intrinsic nature, when they enter into debate, is going to assume that the subject that is being examined has no intrinsic nature. So therefore, any perception that relates to it as if it possesses intrinsic nature is going to be distorted. So therefore, there is no commonly accepted criteria that validates the subject that is being analyzed. So here, in this reading, Tsongkhapa is pointing out that the Bhava Viveka himself becomes the object of critique. So there are slightly two different ways of reading this passage. So the main point of contention really is whether or not one accepts the notion of inherent existence. So, and when a valid cognition perceives an object, whether or not that valid cognition is erroneous with relation to its intrinsic nature, or whether it is non-erroneous in relation to its intrinsic nature. So the main point of contention is whether or not one can accept intrinsic nature of things, intrinsic existence of things.
나중에 denshi kwaya o chagya denyi da kwa chagya chi so that the Day6-am de and the jobshod ba chi jobshod ba lo da Day6-am de da denyi da tetanas ni so 규진을 떼는 중에 규진이 termat인 디체블 들어오셔. 다디 슈데 대단하 달라스. 땡디 달라스. 정신이 동반이 셔윤데 샹라 라레버티 다 시도테. 샹라 라레버티 테두자네 다 땡디 달라스. 미소네. 달라 땡디 달라. 테타나 동해야 테디. 규진을 떼는 중화라 동해 샤고 떼는 뭐 중화라 동해 미로죠.你说嘛？他读经有呢，当然你老毛钱呢，他读些呢，帮让他写吧，他特别写不的，东南写吧，都贵州帮我，我们公司写吧，都咱们广播中了，他有那贵州送的说吧，他们这容我是，是哎呢，是这个嘛，容的差的，东尼台呢，人性有东尼台呢，电子台呢，东海台，贵州台。다 들려야 그래서 공부 뭐 싶습니다. 군중 자와디 대권한지로 먹고시 비주잖아요. 다 되게 군중 봉로인 거 통인도잖아요. 대방배 좀 취진수 답변 고된도 좀. 다 대문도 제약이 근데 남된도 좀. 대인도잖아요. 고람 주윤도 최고조도 대균대지 강사 박박 강사도 좀. 달라되는 밀러벨 긴도 된 좀. 다 구조스부터 좀 해보고 자상하다 즉 사제비 최고에 도당 차산디 대니가는 라이트.
So this actually points towards the important understanding that it is when you have a developed understanding of the two truths, then you have the basis for a deeper understanding of the significance of the Four Noble Truths. So we already discussed that earlier. So for example, Tsongkhapa here writes on page 135, second paragraph, he says that this being the case, which he's referring to the understanding of emptiness in terms of intrinsic existence. He says that dependent origination is tenable with an emptiness of intrinsic existence, and when dependent arising is tenable, suffering is also tenable, for suffering may be attributed only to what arises in dependence on causes and conditions. So in other words, Tsongkhapa is making the connection that once it becomes possible for you to maintain the understanding of ultimate reality in terms of emptiness of intrinsic existence, this then enables you to understand dependent origination. When dependent origination becomes tenable, then the notion of suffering becomes tenable, because suffering is a dependently arisen causal phenomena. And when suffering becomes tenable, then understandable, then the origin of suffering becomes understandable. And among the origin of the suffering, the root really is the ignorance with relation to the ultimate nature of reality. So because of this, one also, as explained before, comes to the understanding of the possibility of its cessation. So when you understand the possibility of a cessation, then you will also understand that the possibility of a path that would lead to that cessation. And true path and the cessation together constitute what we call the true dharma, the dharma jewel. And when dharma jewel becomes tenable, possible, then one can also envision an individual who can embody that dharma, and that person would be the sangha. And if there is a sangha, then the perfection of that sangha would be the Buddha. So in this way, the Four Noble Truths become tenable, and also the three jewels become tenable. So we can see that how, when you understand the relationship between the two, understanding of the two truths and the four noble truths, then the entire mode of procedure of the Buddhist path becomes clear.
다지네 살샤마 샴데 니버 늦지 저만은 수미 미신 버튼 봐스
So the next major outline that we will be dealing is
늦으시면 수미 집을 담아서 다들 당부디 리베 제수미 수단에 각의 순지 민요를 담아서 다들이다. 다 대티도가 고다가 술로서도劝되다. 인로는 여담 매담 겸 미지 셔바도 소보고는 수신도 줘봤니? 대코나에도 줘봐지 거다. 터도 줘봐지 것이 자원이라. 리버티 수소기 겨와 제 서버니 고장 민도에 댕을 태베게 매도 개들다 리베 제 무슨은 리베 캡베 리베 캡바레스 다 리베 캡션도 아니 예버 샤싱 말레스 세메미고 예베 생이잖아 실전에 세메 캡 리베 캡나 예버 샤도 말바스 냠나스 단 디니 리베 제 무슨보다 리베 너버니 찍도 쳐봤대 소도와 리베 많이 봤대 리버티 자네 니야 매버차고 그 이누 가리 이미 자유 자네 그 이누 수주가 매사 니야야 말거다 이네 그 여다 매사디 이누수 여버지 말와 그 이누수 주가 매봐 거라 민점 다섯 뭐 여버지 거다 사들이 인도 그 리베 잼스버리 그 리베 매봐 말거다 다 리베 매봐도 가르쳐 놓고 가르치라 돼 다외 정신자의 많이 봐야 캐교라서 다외 정신 시루 인루 진의 자유잖아 많이 다 리베 자야의 정신고 캐교 다 리베 많이 배치 리베 캐교다 저상가 리베 내가 리베 가서 많이 보니고 가서 리베 잼에서 봐도 리베 내가 가가랬어 야도와
So, in the next major outline, we read from page 156 here. Sorry, it starts from page 155, where the main outline that Tsongkhapa is discussing now is showing that the Madhyamaka critique does not eradicate conventional existence. So within this, we read from page 156, the first para, where Tsongkhapa writes, a proper analysis of whether these phenomena, forms and so on, exist or are produced in an objective sense is what we call a line of reasoning that analyzes reality, or a line of reasoning that analyzes the final status of being. Since we Madhyamakas do not assert that the production of forms and so on, or the arising of forms and so on, can withstand analysis by such reasoning, our position avoids the fallacy that there are truly existent things. If these things cannot withstand rational analysis, then how is it possible for someone to exist when reason has refuted it? So that's the question. And the reply that is given is, you are mistakenly conflating the inability to withstand rational analysis with invalidation by reason. So this is an important point Tsongkhapa is making, the distinction between something that is incapable of withstanding a critical analysis and something that is proven to be invalidated by that critical analysis. So in other words, he's saying that, for example, when we subject things like arising and so on to critical analysis by means of analyzing whether things come into being from themselves or from others and so on, then already we are entering a domain of analysis that is really ultimate form of analysis. And since the existence of things are not posited from the ultimate standpoint, Tsongkhapa is saying that so these arising and so on facts cannot withstand ultimate analysis, and the fact that they cannot withstand ultimate analysis is not the same as ultimate analysis somehow invalidates them or negates them. So one should be able to make a distinction between that which is negated by reason and that which is not found through that critical reasoning.
Yeah.
And here, and this is made clear. For example, yesterday we cited from Khongtang Rinpoche when he says that in the context of a philosophical view, a view of emptiness, because we are searching for the intrinsic nature, so in that context, when we do not find that intrinsic nature, this constitutes the negation of intrinsic nature.
다디 체매 주모도 다네 거버 밑에 왔다 서진 뉴스였다 니소 다디 거나마 아다 믹서 나왔나 참아면 신 송대야 다디디 질 참아이 못 가봐 말이지 우마벨 롤이야 그런 고물로 주고 다 송랑의 용어에 전에 참아 시송비야래 무슨 참아 제바 참아 룸 참아 가사데 백년전이 참았어 참아 시송도 와 참여 남자 여러다 저자가 다 안다 믿어 나와는 참으면 있어야돼 아니 참아 찔까 말이지 미소기 로디 디기라 각선 나이 있잖아요 그런 대중면에 이루어지는 것도 와서 봐 대중면에 지어지는 게 열때 이내 대중면에 이거 나와 달라 달라도 추어져 봐도 대 주야도 참아쳐 말이지 봐 서하다 디스비야래 다 디샴데 녀로사지 어느 시제에 들어가래 가야 디 오문 넘버 7디 무슨 일도 더다네 했습니다 시제에 들어 지금 차고좀 장나제 디슈데 디니 룸드 장네 디슈데 디니 미도 나오나요 참으면 셔서도 민도와 토베네 신도 셔도 셔버 차오스 니소니 대다른 미기 시야발로서 어떤 게 되실다.
So the next outline that we will look at is the second one, which is you cannot eradicate conventional phenomena by refuting them through investigating whether valid cognition establishes them or not. So here, the main point being made is whether the Nagarjuna's standpoint or Nagarjuna's system accepts any notion of valid cognition. And for example, there are citations from the sutra which states that the eyes, the nose, and the ears are not valid cognitions. And here, Tsongkhapa explains that these statements in the sutras are not rejecting valid cognitions in general. So, in fact, in immediately after the statement of this line where eyes, the sensory perceptions are not to be taken as valid cognitions, in Chandrakirti's Entering the Middle Way, he then follows that up by saying that if these are valid cognitions, then what need is there for the minds of the... Yes. So this is actually in the sutra, where it says that if these sensory perceptions are valid, then what need is there for the parts of the noble beings, Arya beings, and their perspectives? So the subsequent lines already suggest clearly in what context the notion of valid cognition is being negated here, and in relation to what the valid cognition is being negated here. So Tsongkhapa explains that these statements in the sutra do not reject that the notion of valid cognition in general, but rather reject the validity of these sensory perceptions in relation to the ultimate nature of things, because it is the perspective of the Arya noble beings whose cognitions are valid when it comes to the ultimate mode of ultimate reality of things. And so if you look at the sensory experiences, sensory perceptions, even at the perceptual level, there is an appearance of things as possessing some kind of inherent existence. So on that level, there is an element of deception, there is an element of an error, but that does not mean that these perceptions are somehow totally invalid. They may be erroneous at the level of their perceptions, but that does not mean they are totally invalid. So, and also in Nagarjuna's own writing, we find mentions of at least four different classes of valid cognition. He speaks of direct perception as a form of valid cognition, inferential cognition, cognition based upon testimony, and cognition based upon analogical cognition. So this analogical or cognition in the form of analogy is sometimes also referred to as cognition derived from perception of likeness, similarity.
지인 사만일 모두부터 야마르데 이내 다 타가타게 지레게 개발돼 베니제게 사마다 루그사마.
So in general, in fact, all forms of valid cognition can be subsumed into the two classes. One is the direct perception and the inferential cognition. So because of their specific functions, the valid cognition based on testimony or testimonial cognition or analogical cognitions are listed separately because of their specific functions, because the immediate kind of premise and that gave rise to these valid cognitions are either analogical reasoning, or a reasoning based on testimony. But indirectly, they are also a form of inferential cognition.
That is one. That is that. One is she given the ballet side. Chen Dishu, she given the long to Tani, Dishu de Kazade. She Milos of a Shivan, Samaim, Chirkawa, she's a Chanyamnas. Didn't meet now and some of the shares of the middle, top when should share showers.
And then there is on page 164, Tsongkhapa cites from Chandrakriti's commentary on the 400 stanzas on the middle way, and then on page 165 he then comments upon this in the following: how do you interpret this general refutation of the position that visual consciousnesses and so on are valid cognitions? And then in response, Tsongkhapa writes, unlike the passage, eye, ear, and nose are not valid, this passage has been a source of grave doubt. Therefore, I will explain it in detail.
That's why 대들 미기 쉐바로 속와는 무슨 임바도 참아이 먹가바니 떡에면 더바가바 임베 토말 된 룩잖아서 시집에 레벨룽도마 거네 다디 슈슈데 말룽디 대샤마 교인도잖아요 되도와 시송바 따르스 다 딱금들한테 총 랭대 송교다 랭대 제니 시송바 따르 똑바다 대신 머추의 셰바니 무슨 일도 돼도 다디지다 세메트니 시작이잖아요. 아니 가사지부터 말이라 무슨 하다 무슨 일이다. 저한테 정유 때마다 스타트를 놓았어. 전에도 세메트니 시작. 다음에 무슨 세메트니 시작이잖아요. 똑바다 대신 머추의 지고스 머추가 시작이거든. 다 되게 머추의 단다디 다 질 머추와라 진당 편을 못 주었어. 진당 편을 밀어왔다. 출발을 사는 근데 지금 조양이 그냥 사여버렸다. 진당 시들 여번 난시 곧 밀어와. 로티 시들 소원 난시 편 내다마시. 로티 능주를 매가체. 로티 능주던 진주 가가체. 변나 제바 참아 추외로 있었어야다. 뒤 추외 있어야 돼. 그 랑산 나오는 추외 있어. 그봐. 그러나 돈이도 제바데 추별로 있습니다. 랑산 나올 때네. 디송비하러 봐. 그래서 다 안듯이 그런 진당의 유태를 밀어올 때 안듯이 시야돼야 돼. 그 능유를 시기가 그래. 있어야다. 그래서 이제 이르잖아요. 달라 뭐주원이 유지랑 게 천이 지전나버 전부 제배. 오브 셰베 무슨 나게 랑산 제배나 수로로 속에 랑게 천이니 무슨 하고 대다게 샤샤임베. 대다 참을 로사야 유하고 대 랑게 천이니 뭐 더도스. 나한테 가사를 개출하게. 가서 대모왕신 나서는 사람들 지금 미국 소통야 나야 자퇴할 상월로 전쟁원의 여것이 나이도 와. 그래서 다디 전의 정신기 예배 주치터도 되와. 당 아주 년도면 누가 왔다. 누가 셔야 돼. 근데 섬섬베다 현지 가요도잖아요. 섬섬베 현지 예배 아니 리뷰 주고 하면 또 투구도 왔다. 이제 삼아졌으니 셔야 되고 그러다. 지상 왔다 디임버리. 전이 랑선을 랑선하고 되디 추의 시반자는 디 최디 적지리야. 샤도와 말에 사진에 인도산에 라산나와도 밀루베다 로지 샤라이 로변데니 차번 교와다 랑고 모여 주보면 랑고 생이 주보냐 타녀도야 미시베 옹부셔바 되는 랑산은 사만 갈시 되는 디다 사만이 뭐 까봤는데 되는 유네 랑고 생이로 사만 되고 거고 해라 당 고수 안쓰기 룽 다가다 나네 미투바 나야라 그 tenjin ngene yeba nangi yorde tenjin ngene yeba nawan shi dubde yana dagde nangsam dei ma siba dagde zano sad do gwajida ni gwajide komendo wa rijita na ya mikyu kedi chui na nyawa nam di ji me tong so na shi mikyu kedi chui me na nyer chi me na sad do ko was 대신 동물을 랑세 나대야 돼 되는 주제야나 콜파 랑세 주임이 그 내루로 가서다 대코는 이제 집에 봐 짜요나 세트세도 줘야 돼 dim도 가스 사들이 인도산에 가다 매바디 집에 짜요나 매바디 다 주도 단 된진 내주데 매바디 이는 능수데 tenjimane yebaji nayo kutuwa ko nane mitumberes dinje yende shebati luore sada tselati chuore sada sumu yosari gosu ni jomne deji namshina zumu luor sumbo te kekso teya luor sumbo miluwa kane samayi mogo de miluwa lulu kanyi nas namba shendu nebe ngobola namba shendu nawa she sumbo di yende wanshin namba sukchoso yu ngabo tenam rangi sinyi ki modru shilu rangi sinyi to nawe 대다게 챙이는 참 뭐이노 셔봤대. 너나 원부 셔봤다 유명한 산다 참 뭐인데 유명한 산 나올을 줄 루에치데. 유명한 생이기 동신도 랑산도 나래 칠 빼는 등이 나래 셔봤신 냠도 공부 어디셔.
So in commenting upon this particular statement from Chandrakirti's commentary on the 400 stanzas, then Tsongkhapa goes on to write that this is on page 165. As we will explain, this is last paragraph, second last. The master Chandrakirti does not accept, even conventionally, that anything exists essentially or by way of its intrinsic character. Thus, how could he accept this claim that the sensory consciousnesses are valid with regard to the intrinsic character of their objects? Therefore, this refutation of the claim that the sensory consciousnesses are valid is a refutation of the view that they are valid with regard to the intrinsic character of the five objects. So, Chandrakirti is commenting upon Chandrakirti here. What Tsongkhapa is explaining is that when we talk about certain perception or perspective as being erroneous or invalid or deceptive, I think we have to understand in relation to what. And also, for example, and generally speaking, at the level of conceptual thought, and the understanding that is that even the realization of emptiness, at least with relation to the kind of the appearance, on the level of appearance, even there there is an element of distortion, there is an element of error. However, with relation to the actual object that is being comprehended, then it is valid. So one needs to make a distinction between a mode of apprehension of something and the way in which that object is perceived. So the perceptual level and the comprehension or apprehension level. And however, here Chandrakirti is really negating the notion of valid cognition proposed by other masters like Bhava Viveka, for whom, when they say that sensory perceptions such as visual experiences and auditory and so on are valid with relation to their objects, and they are also claiming that they are valid in relation to the intrinsic nature of these objects as well, Rangchen, which is Savalakshana. So what Chandrakirti is pointing out is that even with relation to the intrinsic character of the object that they are perceiving, they are erroneous. And because when they perceive the objects to possess an objective inherent existence. And however, that the content of that perception, which is the inherent existence of the object, is untenable. And because if it is the case that they do possess reality, then when we subject them to critical analysis and seek their essence and seek their intrinsic nature, that intrinsic nature should become clearer and clearer, more obvious. And here, for example, Nagarjuna in his Precious Garland gives the analogy that if mirage is truly water, then the closer you get to it, the more obvious the water should become. However, the closer you get to it, the perception of water begins to dissolve. Similarly, if intrinsic nature that we perceive in the objects do truly exist, then the more we search for them, the clearer they should become to our mind, which is not the case. So in this way, Chandrakirti points out that even our visual and sensory perceptions are erroneous when it comes to the intrinsic nature of the objects themselves, because the objects do not possess the intrinsic nature as our visual sensory perceptions tend to perceive. So in this way, what Chandrakirti is pointing out is that there is a disparity or a gap between the way we perceive objects and the way objects truly exist or really are. And because of this disparity or a gap, there is an element of distortion, there is an element of invalidity in our perception.
Oh yeah, that is true. 저장가 따르면 랭댕기 장센의 시기여버디 따오노 좀전 세버로 가도 왔을로나 따디 샴데
Sorry, actually, I forgot something. In fact, just as we, at the level of our sensory perceptions, we perceive things and objects to possess some kind of intrinsic nature, and it is on that basis of our perception, we then assume they possess this objective inherent existence. And in fact, it is this very perception of reality, of the intrinsicness, which we use as a rationale for believing in their objective inherent existence. For example, the mind-only school, when they propound the notion of arising from another, other factors, they say that we don't need to establish the validity of the notion of arising from other, because arising from other factors is something that we can directly perceive. And so what they are presenting is the very fact of something that we perceive as being the basis for their possessing intrinsic nature. So, and then to read further from Tsongkhapa's text, so then he writes on page 165, the last para, this refutation is made by way of the Bhagwan, the Blessed One's statement that consciousness is false and deceptive. The statement that it is deceptive refutes its being non-deceptive, and this in turn refutes its validity, because that which is non-deceptive is the definition of valid cognition. In what sense is it deceptive? As Chandrakirti puts it, it exists in one way but appears in another. So here pointing about the disparity between the perception and reality. This means that the five objects, form, sounds, and so forth, are not established by way of their intrinsic character, but appear to the sensory consciousness as though they were. Therefore, those sensory consciousnesses are not valid with regard to the intrinsic character of their objects. And then he continues, in brief, what Chandrakirti intended in this passage is that the sensory consciousnesses are not valid with regard to the intrinsic character of the five objects, because they are deceived in relation to the appearance of intrinsic character in the five objects. This is because the five objects are empty of intrinsic character, yet appear to have it. For example, it is like a consciousness that perceives a double moon.
참아 좀 킥 미급에나 타녀에 쉐번 나올라 참아 찍고 뭐 있노. 그래서 나도 내려오신 줄.
Yes. So, and then Tsongkhapa makes a kind of a concluding statement. He says, therefore, because these statements negate the sensory perceptions and so on as being valid with respect to the intrinsic nature, therefore they do not negate these perceptions as being invalid, negate as these perceptions as being valid in general. So therefore, these statements do not negate the conventional cognitions as being valid in general.
Day6-am 다 로벨 랭랭기 타녀도 랑세 시기부터 Day6-am 저는 트리블 되거나 대단한 셰바들도 수조 타녀도 나머지고 참을 밑에디 타녀도 수소로 트리블을 시하나 저버를 차대스 니스왜 비교로데 쇼를 식스만체나 달로벨 랭기 선산배 더바까인도잖아요 니스와 어디 딜라스 로벨 랭데제니 수소로 타녀도 랑세 유튜브 뭐 여버 셰바 인데 달로벨 랭데기 타녀도 랑세 시기 예베다 좀젠디 로벨 랭데랑기 차직네 로벨 랭데기 또게 바가 나와 우먼님부터 랑제 나리아 아니 코자네 가서 남버 셰발라 아니 가서 타녀 아니 무슨 독대스 나만은 들어오는 데는 치면 동안 넘버 10에 인도산에 넘버 10은 강사가 타니 강사 다 타니 도구야 그래서 넘버 10도 강사가 생실을 했을 때 소요다 디직스하고 샤도와 다 안데 로벨 링링가 안데 잡지 저시로 좀 나나 자시로 좀 저시로 좀 나나야 로벨 링데지 수소로 다팅 10에 선전대 군다라 랑세 유튜브 뭐 매베 천이 원이 매버 더버 고바나스 다 선전배 에네 콜로 발베급리야 수는 남녀가 봐 주셔서 원이 뭐 주버리 현재 송샤야 돼 다시 심을 가나 차달 주그레스 야 너디 배 가서 그래 콜로 담는 시체네 랑세 요 송샤부 들대 저기 말이스다 안다데 너디 동니 숨부야래 이내다디 너도 현실을 때네 디 공부 지시면 쉬어버렸어 나 콜로 타면 아니 랑신이 주무도 차신의 수시로 디토네 아니 콜로 파베도 다디 신고그레스 콜로 파베 순남지 알레 순남지 쉬어도 뭐니 매봐 수시야디 타가는 돼야 말이야 딱 가르쳤나 뭐니 매봐 나봤습니다 나번 뭐니 미수 숨을 거네 뭐니 매번 송어레스 딱 그래서나 아니 샤와 아니 말에 군다 샤와 용주 다 군다랑 세니 뭐 줘봐 샤와 겨와 뭐니 매봐 다 되네 용주 된다고 뭐니 매봐 뭐니 미수 숨을 거네 뭐니 매번 송어레 마도 아니 수는 남에게 봐 주셔서 저 뭐니 매봐 랑세니 뭐 줘봐 깨좀 말이스 다들 소프레 So that the distance of the Susha, Tipa, Lobel, Dengi, Tipa, Kain, Lusane, Semzambe, Gundarangsin, Madrupsen, Setea, Di, Gundala, Dochita, Takba, Sentam, Dochita, Takba Cha, Takba Cha, Dochita, Taksha Nichi, Dochis lived to Tadotche, Takba Chas Luzenda, Dochigi, the Tadok, Taksumti, Tadok, Takba Cha. 제가 노제도 따고 니기 따고 체네스 모두 캐버도 존도베 다도 놀라 타녀도랑시 이 뭐니 매번 되나 샤와고 뭐로 꾸었다고 누로 셰따베나 샤와로 타녀도랑시 이 주변 뭐셔를 살고스 다섬섬베 천이 뭐니 그 군다랑시 뭐 줘서 군다리야 도제도 따고 딱선이 체체 당시로 지금이나 로벨레 되게 다라랑시 뭐 주시르스 아이 미팅이스 무슨 좋아해서 다 도치를 잘해나 되게 장신이 뭐 주시하나 근데 가서 우리 군들 주도 순자래 장신이 이게버디 시기버디
Then the question is, how do we, on what basis can we infer that the master Bhava Viveka actually subscribes to the notion of intrinsic existence, existence by means of svalakshana, self-defining characteristics. So here one could cite two examples. One is the well-known statement from Blaze of Reasoning, which is an auto-commentary on his text, Essence of Middle Way, where Bhava Viveka says that in our case, we accept the sixth mental consciousness to be the true referent of the term person. So there is, implication is that he accepts identity of a person that can be found when you search for the true referent of the term person. And secondly, Tsongkhapa points out here, when in Bhava Viveka's commentary on Nagarjuna's text, Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, Bhava Viveka, in negating or in refuting the mind-only position vis-a-vis the interpretation of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, mind-only school interprets the Buddha's turning of the wheel in the following manner. For them, the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma is non-definitive, and the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, although its content is definitive, which is emptiness, however, this is a sutra that should not be read on the literal level, because on the literal level, the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, negate intrinsic existence across the board, from form in the list of enumeration, from form to the omniscient mind of the Buddha. So on the literal level, although the sutra negates intrinsic existence across the entire spectrum of phenomena, the mind-only school argues that this sutra needs to be interpreted on the basis of the Samdhi Nirmochana Sutra, the sutra unraveling the intent of the Buddha, the third turning. And so therefore, when we read the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, we read the negation contextually by identifying different natures of phenomena. So they speak in terms of imputed phenomena, the dependent or imputed nature, the dependent nature, and the consummate or ultimate nature. And so when Buddha states in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra that all phenomena are devoid of intrinsic existence and identity, this identitylessness of phenomena is understood contextually in relation to dependent phenomena, imputed phenomena, and the ultimate phenomena. So with relation to the dependent phenomena, what is being negated is intrinsic arising and or ultimate arising, and with relation to imputed phenomena, intrinsic existence is negated, and or existence by means of self-defining characteristics is negated, and with relation to the ultimate or consummate nature, existence by means of ultimate mode of being is negated. So in this way, they contextually interpret the Buddha's teaching on emptiness as presented in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. So in commenting upon this, Bhava Viveka states that if your statement that the imputed phenomena are devoid of existence by means of self-defining characteristics, then when you say imputed phenomena, we can analyze that in terms of that which imputes and that which is imputed. And if you reject intrinsic existence to that which imputes, then you're talking about language and concepts, because it is the language and concepts that impute characteristics. And if you reject language and concepts to possess inherent existence, then you will be falling into an extreme of nihilism. So by making that allegation or accusation, Bhava Viveka the implication is that Bhavaviveka himself accepts intrinsic existence to language, concepts, and so on, conceptual thoughts, and so on.
다른 식의 로비 까마라 실에 아니 너도 공제 이게 있는 원 가서 올게 다 천이숨 지금 가서 올게 수샤도 제디 근데 단단발 아니 겨왕 원님에 받아 용루 단단 원님에 갔으니 단단발 그 캬버 짠 각제 캬버 짠네 아다디 우면슈 죽을해서 수고야래 우면다 수고야래 시장에 가당 예린 돌이야 소이 버려
So similarly, Kamala Shila, when commenting upon the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, he qualifies all the negation with a caveat that from the ultimate point of view or on the ultimate level. So and Kamala Shila also explains that it is the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, this unraveling the intent of the Buddha, that establishes the definitive reading of the scriptures. So, in other words, Kamala Shila also accepts the Samdhinirmochana Sutra to represent a definitive sutra. So this implies that both Kamala Shila and Shantarakshita also subscribe to the notion of Svabhava or Svalakshana.
So that umabalaya tanyadoranze shegenchik ranze mishingichik da nicha.
So in this way we understand that among the middle way thinkers there were two camps. One camp that accepts the notion of Svalakshana on the conventional level, existence by means of self-defining characteristics, and another camp that rejects the notion even on the conventional level.
다 Day6-am 디스토하다. 다야 Day6-am 다. 다 Day6-am 대요. 안다 로빌랭den기 저기 가서 우리가 뒤처럼 싹거든 뒤것은 샤야. 다 디네고레 로빌랭den기 타이도 장세 시기부터 세부도 직세. 대 차오시는데. 다 디슈데 다 차오도 저기 매개니 사사 사딘다. 나래 차오시지 뭐가 제 저한테 차오시지 이거 다
So that later there is a section in the text where also Tsongkhapa points out Bhavaviveka's position vis-a-vis the concept of atomic structure of material things, and he makes distinctions between aggregation and collection, and also teases out that Bhavaviveka's position represents some form of acceptance of intrinsic nature. Of course, these sections are very difficult, quite tough. So and then there is an expression that when it comes to reading the more difficult sections of the text, you should be like an old man without teeth, trying to eat something. So when you cannot bite, you just swallow it. So for me also, these sections will be very difficult, but for you also, maybe even more difficult, so we'll skip those sections. So, when we come to that kind of part of the text, then it's better to give a kind of a little time off for both the teacher and the students.
That is true that this one. 다 타니베 시바를 때 가서 우리 치지 말라고 했습니다. 샤디야. 다 드마치 Day6-am 디싱이 됐다. 대질 우모베 대다 출발을 줘라스. 니 소리. 어나 rāngsā nāngā chūyā lō yīnā, āni tsāmē mī wā yuebē tsānyi sī sī gā rē, tsāmē chūgā shī chū sī gā rē, āni chūjī kī tsāmā mī dūgā sī. rāngsā nāngā chūgā shī tā yīmbā, chā tī tū zāne, chūgā shī tā sō rā, tā rāngsā nāngā kō chū tā na, tī jōshī yōng mā sī zāne, āni tī gyōng yā mā rē sī. Tē chī rū mā bē tētā chūgā rā chā rā, tētā nā yāng yu dzūmbā chōgā mī gē dē sī. Nāngā mī tūng bē yu dzūmbā jōshī rā, rāngsā nāngā chūgā lō tē jōshī rā dīgī rē sī. Sō yu dāmbā chōgā nī yu jīn chūgā jōgā, jōgā dāba gyāwā yīnō. 타녀도 최선지 기본적으로 되면 타녀도 좀 영향 군속 담바는 저거야 민게데 워낙 군속 담바사하게 담배 쓰기도 와서 가서 담바 전지 인루 담바 입지라 롱은 담바지 니용으로 와서 그래서 전지 인루 담바 야마레스 근데 이제는 롱은 담바지 거래 롱은 담바데 로칸춘주로 말해 timu tenzing mo tambare stende yin kunzo tamba seage dansati timu tenzing mo tamba sen sugu ya es timashi su ta di shugude 다들 우모베 타녀도 랑을 올라 콘다 연남샤 마부신 조바다 ngom마와 남기 랑은 저 투모 임베다고 되는 타녀도 예변 무슨 신도가에 담바이 나바셔 시 다디 다디도 다디샴데 하는게 디지는 줬대 다디샴데 디다 딘저원 디다니 캐버 고르시베 담도 미나데 나르샤바타 리베 가저 뭐마심 바 런신 고베 리베 타녀베 남르샤고 탐지 지불시베 양다베 따와도 로베 따와노 노노 노냠다 마노노 마노 냠부 손 시지로가 따와치고 이비치로 되나 딘저원을 지금도 공제 양다베 따와 중세는 타는 콘데 이땐데 남르샤고 탐지 랑고 룰라 루에 땡중을 남다 최신도 개와이 비처로서 다 디슈고데 미신이게라고 무지자 남겼더니 지시다보다 주먹이 좀 드단지되다야 예민이 있잖아요. 편요랑 걸로야. 아니 타녀도에 따와나 르 딱좀 레스나 랑자나도 추버리 추버로 딘데지기 아니 가소르에 타녀가 왔겠다. 여സം 시인배이나 아니 똑바 강 소소르베스 람나 나 리부르 지도베 리부르 로티 거도 리부르 지도베 리부르 거버봐 제데 리부르 야마바 자자가다 베나 탁저를 주도 딱베 타고 탁저 준징글레 탁저 주도 능기 열어라 주도 현대가 와 탁저 주도 주야마다 다 주고 풍불을 때네 주도 나한테 로티 니가로 추버려 봐. 장사 나도 주도. 레디네 찍디 타녀도 주주 풍불을 때네 주도 따고티 주도요 봐. 로 밀어라 봐. 참아라 봤다. 죄송아. 자, 이제 인도산에다 로 강소소 렘도 와. 단 용도 사버지 들이샤. 르 마샤베 최야 말할 르 강샤 연미 그소 진짜 송대하게 다와 디캬버 가르쳐 왔더나 대가 타녀도 여벌 되봐도 매번 되봐도 찐로시고 권해 주고 이념 나왔어 타녀베 셰벌로 잡아이 봐 대들 잡고 터는 타녀베 섬으시기 민여봐 대성도 마세베 대콘난 일 쩨베 리시자 민여봐 대수부 때는 타녀를 시작했어.
So then Tsongkhapa then talks about if our perception of everyday objects is erroneous with respect to the intrinsic nature of things, then how is it that they are referred to as conventionally true? So here Tsongkhapa is explaining what is meant, the meaning of the truth in the context of conventional truth and ultimate truth. So he explains that when we use the word truth in the context of conventional truth, and truth here does not have a connotation of objectivity, but rather truth from the perspective of the subjective mind. So in this way, therefore, calling conventional truth a truth does not imply the acceptance of some kind of objective intrinsicness to the phenomena. And then Tsongkhapa goes on to explain that if we fail to recognize, identify the object of negation correctly, and then understand, falsely understand that all the reasoning that negates, the critical analysis and the reasoning that negates intrinsic nature, even on the conventional level, if we come to understand that these reasoning undermine all the validity of everyday transactions and conventions, then one will fall into a position where no distinction can be made between a correct view and an incorrect view, and where both of them will be either false or either true, and therefore one will fall into a standpoint that would represent a grave erroneous view, and then therefore and then he writes, as a result, prolonged habituation to such a view does not, this is on page 178, second para, as a result, prolonged habituation to such a view does not bring you the least bit closer to the correct view. In fact, it takes you further away from it, for such a wrong view stands in stark contradiction to the path of dependent origination, the path in which all of the teachings on dependent origination of cyclic existence and nirvana are tenable within our system. And then Tsongkhapa cites from Chantakirti, and then, so the question is how do we then understand that if our perception of all phenomena as possessing intrinsic nature is erroneous, they do not possess any objective inherent existence, then how do we adjudicate what is a correct and what is incorrect understanding? So, for example, between and the question then becomes: does that mean that anything that the mind creates and becomes real? And so, if that is the case, then with relation to the horn on a rabbit's head, a rabbit horn, we can have a thought of that, and the thought of the rabbit's horn actually conjures the image of rabbit's horn, but that doesn't make the rabbit's horn to be real. Similarly, the question is, how do we adjudicate between the following two perceptions, one false and one correct? So, for example, on the basis of a coiled rope, if someone instinctively feels there is a snake there, that perception based upon the seeing a coiled rope is false. However, on the basis of the body of a real snake, one can also have the perception of a snake there. Now, insofar as the perceptions of inherent existence of the objects existing in their own right outside is concerned,
탁제 때문에 주모 주었다. 주기 풍부 랑강원에 주모 주고 찍어냈어.
So insofar as the fact that on the basis of the coiled rope, the snake does not exist, in and of itself, and also on the basis of the snake's aggregates, the body, there is on the part of the aggregates, there is no intrinsically real snake. So insofar as that fact is concerned, they are both exactly the same. And however, one perception is erroneous, incorrect, and the other perception is a correct perception. So the question is, how do we adjudicate between these two forms of perception? Because although we can only accord nominal existence to all phenomena, but that does not mean that anything goes, that it's, reality equates with our concepts. So here, Tsongkhapa then writes, how does one determine whether something exists conventionally? This is on page 178, third para. We hold that something exists conventionally, 1, if it is known to a conventional consciousness, 2, if no other conventional valid cognition contradicts its being as it is thus known, and 3, if reason that accurately analyzes reality, that is, that which analyzes whether something intrinsically exists or not, does not contradict it, we hold that what fails to meet those criteria does not exist. So he provides the criteria by which one can adjudicate a form of perception that is false and a perception that is correct.
So resimability, the penalty you have, penalty or so that was a class out.
So although nothing possesses inherent existence, but there is still at the level of everyday experience harm and benefits and harm. So that means we need to go and eat.